Welcome to the Bible in a Year podcast, a resource from Enter the Bible. Journey with us through the books of the Bible, discovering more about Scripture and how it shapes our lives today. I'm Kathryn Schifferdecker.
And I'm Katie Langston. And today we have a very special podcast because we are going to be talking about the book of Job. And we have Kathryn kind of doing double duty today. So she is a Job scholar. That's one of her main areas of expertise. So I'm going to be kind of taking the role of interviewer and be talking with Kathryn, who's here with us, professor of Old Testament at Luther Seminary, and one of our very favorite guests, Dr. Diane Jacobson, who is professor emerita of Old Testament at Luther Seminary and retired director of the Book of Faith Initiative for the ELCA. So basically, I just get to pick their brains about this wonderful book, and
we get to talk to each other.
That's
because
right.
We love talking about Job.
We do love talking about Job. I've learned from Diane.
And I've learned from Kathryn, so it's good.
Yeah, and it's
awesome.
A really, really important book. So
yes.
We'll try not to be too long, though. Katie will keep us on track.
I'll be as stern a taskmaster as I can be, so.
All right. Sounds good.
All right. So just to kick it off, give us a summary or outline of the book.
So the book of Job is interesting because it's 42 chapters long, and it's actually one of the longer books in the Old Testament. And I think that surprises a lot of people. Like they think they know the story of Job,
right?
And then they actually open it and it's like, oh my gosh.
Because
what they know usually is the very beginning and the very end, right? They know the story of this very righteous man who is afflicted with suffering because of a wager between God and the Satan. We'll talk more about the Satan. And so he loses all his children, he loses all his wealth, and then he's afflicted with bodily sores. And then he goes out to outside the town and scrapes himself with a potsherd. And so they know that, and then they know that his fortunes are restored at the end.
Right.
And that's pretty much what they know. But really, that's just chapters 1 and 2 and chapter 42. And what happens in between is really the kind of meat of the book. And that's this long, long dialogue between Job and his three.
That's introduced first by a lament.
Yes, right.
By Job.
Yeah, in chapter 3.
Which is itself really interesting, which is lots of ways the introduction to a different part of the book.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah, it's, in chapter 3, Job curses the day of his birth, right? I sometimes compare this to the movie, that classic Christmas movie, It's a Wonderful Life, right? Where Bailey, what's his name?
Jimmy Stewart?
Jimmy Stewart's character.
Right.
It'll come to me. He wishes not just that he were dead, but that he had never been born. Right? So this is Job in chapter 3.
That I've never been born.
Yeah. Well, let night claim the night I was conceived. And in the process, he kind of tries to undo creation in chapter 3. And then that prompts his three friends, or so-called friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, to enter into this dialogue with him. Right. And it just goes back and forth, just almost endlessly till chapter, 27. And then the friends are silenced. Job has this interlude of, or at least there's a speech about wisdom and where can wisdom be found in chapter 28. Chapter 29 through 31,
that sounds like it should go in Proverbs, but instead is in the middle of Job. So go figure.
Yeah, it's a completely different tone from the rest of the book. Chapters 29 through 31 are the kind of final defense or summary of Job. So in all these TV court dramas, right, it's the final argument before the jury goes out to consider, right? So he sums up his defense to God and calls on God to answer him. Then you kind of expect God to answer, but then you get this interlude again from chapters 32 through 37 of this fourth friend, Elihu.
It just shows out of nowhere.
He's
comes
like,
up out
guys.
of nowhere.
Yeah.
Crazy.
It's me.
Yeah. He's not mentioned before or after, but he's this young man who's just
gonna set everybody straight.
Exactly. He's been silent because he respects, his elders, but now he just has to speak. So he goes on and on and on and on and on. Then finally in chapter 38, Job hears from God, right? He's been calling on God to answer him almost the whole book, and then God answers. To go back to It's a Wonderful Life, he doesn't get Clarence the angel, the bumbling kind of.
Right.
He gets God in a whirlwind, right? In a tornado, in a whatever, typhoon. God answers Job. But it doesn't, the answer dissatisfies a lot of people.
It's really funny that we call it an answer.
Right. Yeah,
it's a speech.
Yeah.
It's not an answer.
Yeah.
And so when you go listen to that as wanting an answer, you're going to be sorely disappointed.
Yeah. Because God doesn't mention Job's suffering. God, we want God to say, my bad, or
I'm sorry that I apologize. Sorry I made this bet with the
God
Satan.
Says, Yeah. Instead, God says, who are you to question me? Right? One of my favorite characterizations of the whirlwind speeches is from William Safire. He says, it's as if God showed up in a tie-dye T-shirt that says, because I'm God, that's why. I don't know why it's a tie-dye T-shirt, but yeah, because I'm God. That's why.
So listen up.
So a lot of people are disappointed in these whirlwind speeches, but
interestingly, I'm not.
Yeah,
we'll get to that.
I'm not either. But if you take them on their own, they're a beautiful, beautiful poetry about creation.
Right.
And it's this kind of God's eye view of creation that Job is taken on. And it's just gorgeous. Anyway, so that's chapters 38 through 41. And then chapter 42 is as Paul Harvey would say, the rest of the story, right?
Right.
So what happens to Job? Well, he answers God, and we can talk more about that.
God speaks to
the friends and says, you have not spoken, I think, to me rightly, as has my servant Job. So Job offers prayers and sacrifices for his friends. And then his fortunes are restored, and he has 10 more children, 3 of the most beautiful daughters in the land.
Who get names.
Jemima, Keziah, Karen Hapuk. So
I can't remember my own name, so good.
Yeah, well, awesome. They're like Dove and Cinnamon Stick and Horn of Eyeshadow. I follow my teacher, Ellen Davis, saying Rouge Pot. I kind of like that translation. Nice. These very sensual names. And he gets his wealth back but
no servants.
But no servants, yes. And then he dies old and full of days. And that's the book of Job.
And he doesn't get cured.
We might disagree about that, but yeah. Anyway, that's the outline. I've probably gone on too long about it, but that's it's really this narrative frame, right?
Right.
And then this long dialogue between Job and his 3 friends, and then the 4th person, Elihu, and then God speaks. So yeah,
that's really kind of remarkable. But you don't read this book easily sitting down in one sitting, and that's it.
No, that it takes, you get lost. I get lost in there a little bit sometimes, but what would you sum up if you could? I mean, because it is sort of, can be intimidating to dive in. What would you kind of sum up as the message of the book in a few sentences?
I think there's a number of messages, or at least a number of themes that are important. One is just very basically, I think the book of Job is responding to some other books in the Bible, including Proverbs, including Deuteronomy, where a simplistic reading of those books would say, if you're righteous, you will be blessed, and if you're wicked, you will be punished.
Right.
Mm-hmm. I think the book of Job is in conversation with that.
Saying no.
Yeah, saying no, that's not how it works. Yeah. So one of the really important messages, honestly, and it sounds kind of obvious, but is not all suffering is the result of sin, right? Sin leads to suffering, no doubt, and often suffering for, the community of the sinner, not just the sinner.
Right.
But not all suffering is the result of sin. I think that's one of the main messages.
That message is one of the reasons I tend to call Job a theologian of the cross, because we get to suffering as a whole different reality than punishment for sin.
Yeah.
And that whole notion of suffering as being a true way that people have to live. And what do you do with that? And it's redemptive, finally. How crazy is that?
Yeah. Yeah. Diane has this lovely article in our Luther Seminary journal called Word and World. The article is called Job as a Theologian of the Cross. So I would highly recommend that. You can find it on the Word and World website. But Yeah, I think the other way that Job is a theologian of the cross, and I think you say this in your article, he speaks the truth,
Right.
right?
Mm.
And I think that's another message of the book, that in the midst of suffering, it's okay, it's even good to speak the truth about your suffering
Right.
to God.
Right.
We-
It's that lament tradition.
Exactly.
It's
Right.
picking up the lament tradition and saying, this is true speech.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Lament really is the speaking of hurt and grief and anger and questions directly to God. It's a form
Right.
of prayer. And I use this image with my students, right? It's holding on to God with one hand and shaking your fist at God with the other, right? It's like staying in that relationship, holding on to God, not giving up on God, but also being very honest with God.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And Job and Psalms and Lamentations, all of these books.
And Job is probably the best personal lamenter in all of Scripture.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
He's very good at it.
You know what
Yes.
his lament's about, and you listen to him.
Yeah.
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 And God listens.
Yeah, and God commends Job in the end for speaking directly to God. It's some issues with the Hebrew translation, but at the end in chapter 42, verses 7 and 8, God says to the three friends, "You have not spoken to me rightly, as has my my servant Job." I think all English translations say, "You have not spoken about me rightly," which
Right.
is a possible translation as well, but I really think it's to me.
Right.
I think Job is commended for speaking to God, because for all of their theologizing in the middle of the book, the friends never speak to God. They
And
never
they
pray
just
for their
think
friend.
that their job is to explain things and
Yeah.
to
Right.
speak about God.
Right.
Right.
God is righteous.
Right.
God would never do anything wrong.
Yeah.
Defend God in every single way you can. And then
Right.
God comes in and says, that's not true speech.
I don't need
Yeah,
your
right.
defense. Yeah.
Yeah, I
That's
don't need
good.
you to defend me, basically.
Yeah,
Right.
Yeah,
that's
God is
not
big
right.
enough to
I
take.
need you to talk to me.
Yeah.
Not
Yeah.
to,
Yeah, and to speak honestly.
yeah.
Yeah. I would add maybe one more, and that and there's other messages, but I would say, so lament is a faithful response to suffering. That's
Mhm.
and not all suffering is the result of sin. I
Mhm.
would say the last one I want to mention, not to go on too long, is that God creates the world in such a way that it is a beautiful but risky world, and that we're called to live with humility in that world and with wonder and delight and freedom to delight in God's creation as God does.
Yeah. I would add a lot. I mean, we could
Sure.
talk about
Right.
the,
Yeah.
which we will, I'm sure, the speech. But I also think God is saying to Job, you're my kid, just like all of creation is my kid. And my kids are not who you expect them to be. They're not the lambs and the cows that give milk and everything. They're the unclean beasts.
Right.
They're
The wild animals.
wild animals.
Yeah.
They're the unexpected. You're like them.
Huh.
And like them, you're my child. So I love you. But I love you not because you deserve it, but because you're my kid.
What's a way in if someone were, maybe picking it up for the first time? How would you suggest?
Wow. I think that is so complicated in this book. But
Yeah.
I mean, a way in is to, first of all, know you're going to be yanked all over the place. So know that from the get-go.
Yeah.
So you might want to read the first couple of chapters with this dialogue and what happens to Job. Say, how would you react to that? What kind of story is that? And just think about the story part. And then look at the laments and say, all right, where am I with this? What's Job saying? And then what are the best and worst moments of the friends? Like, I would say the best moment is when they sit quietly.
Yeah, right. At the beginning.
At the beginning.
Yeah.
And actually
don't
do
talk.
what they're supposed to do. But then, what's the problem with their speeches? Why is it that they aren't? Because it sounds like a praise band half the time.
Yeah.
And why isn't that good? So I think asking those kinds of questions and then reading this whirlwind speech about creation and saying, what do I learn from this?
Yeah.
What's there? What don't I learn?
Right.
What makes me mad about this speech?
Yeah.
And maybe I should listen differently. But wow.
Yeah, it's a complicated book, for sure. I like all of those suggestions. I would say maybe just one other thing, like as you get into the long dialogue from chapters 4 through 27, if you find your eyes glazing over, that might be part of the intent.
Yeah.
Oh,
Right?
good.
I think the author wants you to see how the friends just keep digging a hole for themselves and aren't really listening to Job.
Right.
And that can become kind of tedious.
Maybe that's why people don't come to church.
Yeah. Maybe
Sounds
so.
like
Our
the friends.
sermons are just a whole lot of blah,
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. That's a good characterization of the friend's speeches. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. Job himself, I think his speeches, they
do.
are
They
repetitive
have,
in certain ways too, but
have
there's a
forward
kind of
momentum.
movement in Job's
Right.
speeches that I think the friends don't have.
Right.
They just kind of get more and more entrenched in their worldviews, and Job kind of opens up. Yeah.
All right, well, it's time for our favorite part of the episode, which is Bible Bingo. And this is where you have collaborated, the two of you have collaborated on 5 concepts, words, people, places, etc., that would go on your bingo card as you read the book. So we'll do those in somewhat quick succession. And the first word that you both put on there is suffering.
Yeah. So I think when people who haven't read the book, and even those who have too, this is probably the first word that comes to mind, honestly, when you think about the book of Job, because of all the books in the Bible, with the possible exception of Lamentations, I think it dives the most deeply into the questions of suffering. Like why do we suffer? Right. Where is God in our suffering? Right? What kind of world is this that allows such suffering?
What kind of God allows this suffering?
Yeah.
I mean, the basic question is that suffering question.
Yeah. And that's not all the book is about, but it's certainly it's the major topic, I think, of the book. So, yeah, I remember meeting a guy. I was sitting on an airplane heading out to Montana for a meeting, and there was a guy sitting next to me. And often I sleep on a plane, but we got into a conversation, and he's a recovering alcoholic, and without knowing, I think I had told him I taught Bible, but without knowing that I had a special interest in Job, he said he was one time just flat out drunk, like passed out. He woke up, and there's a Bible sitting next to him on the floor, open to the book of Job.
Wow.
And he started reading it, and it really spoke to him, he said, which was really fascinating. Yeah, so I think suffering is a major, major theme in the book.
Right, next is righteousness.
Yeah. And what's the relationship of righteousness to suffering?
Yeah.
Because the assumption that most of us bring, and the book of Job invites us to bring this assumption, is if you're righteous, you don't suffer. It's the unrighteous who suffer. Suffering is because you sin.
Right.
And it's punishment from God.
Right.
So then you have to ask, so what is, not just what is suffering, but what's righteousness? What makes somebody righteous? Why is Job at the beginning bragged about because he's righteous?
Right.
Shouldn't God brag more about Job at the end of the book than at the beginning of the book? Just the whole, what righteousness is very much part of this book.
Next, I like so-called friends.
With friends like this, who needs enemies?
Yeah,
Exactly.
Yeah, these 3 friends, and then the 4th one, Elihu, they're not very good pastoral counselors and not very good friends. With the exception, at the beginning, right? So at the end of chapter 2, they come, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar come to see Job because they've heard about his suffering. And then they sit with him in silence for 7 days and 7 nights.
Right.
That's when they sit Shiva. Yeah. Do you want to explain what Shiva is?
Well, just that when someone dies, you go and be with
in the Jewish tradition.
Mm-hmm. You don't try to explain anything. You don't try to. You do try to comfort, but you don't comfort with words of explanation.
Right.
You bring food. You say the ministry of presence kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
So they're wonderful friends then, right? They're just sitting with him.
When they open their mouth.
Then they open their mouth and everything goes to hell. Yeah. It's just really, really bad. And the thing is, Job disturbs their worldview, right? Like they thought what we were just talking about, right? They thought if I'm righteous, I'll be rewarded. And if I'm bad, I'll be punished. And they know that Job is a righteous person, the most righteous person, the book says.
Right. But he must not be.
But he must not be because he's suffering so bad. So there must be some secret sin, right? Because if such a righteous man can suffer like he did, then what protects me?
Right. Then we're all in danger.
I just think they're protecting themselves because they're more interested in protecting themselves and their worldview than in comforting their friend.
Right.
They accuse him of terrible, terrible things by the end. Yeah. You know, you haven't cared for the widow and the orphan. You've taken food away from the hungry. And none of these things are true, but they
must be true.
They must be true.
Otherwise, you wouldn't be suffering.
Exactly. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, so-called friends is a good way to talk about them, I think.
I like that. Next is Lament.
And we've kind of talked about that.
Yeah.
I mean, that true speech to God is telling the truth to God. I love that. Hanging on with one hand and shaking your fist at the other. That is Job's speeches.
Yeah.
I would add just one thing to what we've said already, and that's the truth that we can hold on to God only because God first holds on to us.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That we can lament because we know that God will never, ever let go of us. Right. We can trust that relationship.
And it's not just that we can, we must.
Yeah. Yeah.
We must lament because that's what God wants from us.
Yeah. God wants truth from us.
Right.
Yeah.
And then finally, creation.
Yeah. You wouldn't expect the response to all this to be this speech about creation.
Right.
That's not how we think about creation usually.
Yeah.
And so...
what does that have to do with suffering?
What does that have to do with it?
Yeah.
So there's this kind of sense of God saying, all right, let me just talk a little bit. It's not so much the order of the universe as the nature of the universe.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I'm in the desert where there's no water and there's no people. What am I doing there? I'm with Leviathan and Behemoth, the beast. What am I doing with them? Why are they the king of all that exists, not these other things? God's whole creation speech is filled with as many questions as it's not an answer thing, although it is a relationship.
Yeah. The fact that God shows up and talks with Job is huge. Yeah.
And I mean, Kathryn knows I talk about this a lot. To me, because Job is himself leprous and therefore unclean, the fact that most of the animals are wild or unclean says, Job, you're my kid not because you're righteous, but because you're like all these other wild and unclean beasts, and I love you, oh unclean beast. What a slap in the face of Leviticus.
Yeah.
Is Job arguing against Leviticus, do you think? You were saying it.
Oh,
you thought maybe Proverbs and Deuteronomy and Leviticus.
Yeah, probably Leviticus too. Yeah.
Take that, Leviticus.
Yeah.
Right. I love all these unclean beasts.
Huh.
Yeah.
What's weird or interesting about the book of Job?
I think part of it is what we've been talking about, that it's not what you expect.
Mm-hmm.
It takes on all these big issues without giving answers and still engages us.
Yeah.
That's maybe not what you would say about what's weird or interesting.
No, I think that's true. I would say, and we referenced this earlier too, that the Satan figure is kind of weird.
Oh,
and
you're
Yeah,
right.
I was going to say that.
Yeah.
That, to me, that's the weirdest part. It's also, like, for me, it's the most troubling part of the book, to be honest. Like,
Yeah.
even
Yeah.
all of the, all of the bad things that happen to him because, like, God's, like, playing games with the devil. What? Do you know what I mean? And I know,
it's not quite the devil. It's
Right.
Yeah.
also, picture a courthouse. This is the prosecuting attorney.
Right,
Okay.
right. Yeah.
right.
And who brings the case to God and says, this guy only worships you because you're really good to him.
Right.
He's only righteous because you're really good to him.
Yeah.
Take away all he has and let's see what happens.
Right.
So it's a kind of courthouse bet.
Yeah. So it's important to note in the Hebrew, Satan or Satan is actually a Hebrew word that means to accuse or to be an adversary.
Mhm.
And in the book of Job, unlike in some other parts of the Bible, it's always the Satan, ha-Satan. It's not translated that way in all English translations, but it's always the Satan, which means it's more of a title than it is a personal name. And so I always say the Satan to follow the Hebrew. And he's more of like he's not the king of demons or
He's
the father
not the
of
same
all
demonic
evil, right?
force that we.
No,
comes
he's not the
later.
same demonic force as in the New Testament or in
Interesting.
Daniel.
But it's not accidental that the word becomes that.
Yeah, right.
So
the accuser.
Yeah, the accuser,
Yeah,
the one who's
yeah.
going to make God. The power the Satan has over God is one of the scary things about the book.
Yeah.
For real life.
But I would say he's more like he's not someone you want as a next door neighbor. He's more like, but he is like, I don't know, the head of the FBI or the CIA. Right?
Okay.
Like his job is to investigate, to go
Right.
to and fro on the earth and to walk up and down on it, as it says in chapter 1. And God asks him, well, tell me what's going on.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, consider this guy, Job.
Yeah, have you considered my servant Job, God says. And the Satan says, as you said,
Actually,
he's
I
righteous,
have.
but does Job fear God for nothing, right?
Right.
The questions are really interesting in the book of Job. Haven't you put this fence around him and protected him from all evil? Of course he's going to be righteous. Look what he gets for it, right?
Right.
But take away everything he has and he will curse you to your face. Now, I want to say this, and I think it's important. I don't believe Job, and I think I probably speak for Diane, I don't think Job is a historical tale.
No.
I think it's a kind of parable in a way, like a really extended parable. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, right? Like there was a man who was going down from Jericho to Jerusalem, and I think the purpose of it is really this kind of wisdom meditation on suffering. Like, what can we say about suffering? What if it's not the result of sin? What if there's this perfectly righteous man who suffers? Why does he suffer? Well, there's a wager between God and the Satan.
Right.
Now what? Right? Now, how do we think about suffering? How do we talk about suffering? How do we talk about God in the midst of suffering? So I really think it's important theologically
That
to say
does seem important.
It's
Like
kind
God
of a thought
doesn't
experiment.
God doesn't actually
God
make
doesn't
bets
play
or
with our
play
lives.
games, right? Yeah,
Exactly.
That
I don't
seems
think God really acts this
better.
way. I think God tests. I think we know that from other parts of Scripture, but I don't think God kills 10 children in order to.
When we're suffering, if some people might say, hey, God, in their lament,
Yeah.
have you been talking to the Satan?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, sure. What are you doing up there?
Yeah.
I guess-
So, that's an important thing to talk about. I don't know if it's weird or interesting, but it is troubling.
I think it's
as you
both
said,
weird
Katie.
and
Yeah,
interesting, maybe in a bad way. So that's good. Thanks for
yeah.
for the clarification. What kind of memorable verses, chapters, or passages should people be sure to kind of dig into?
I think what we've already talked about in terms of chapter 1, paying attention to the questions is really a good way into the book, right? Have you considered my servant Job? Does Job fear God for nothing? And then in chapter 38, where were you when I established the foundations of the earth? The most famous passage in Job is undoubtedly at the end of chapter 19, where Job, he's been railing against God. He's been, accusing God of terrible things.
Right.
And then he's kind of descended into the depths of despair, but he's found something that looks a lot like hope or trust there at the bottom of despair. And he says, "Oh, that my words were written in a book. Oh, that they were, inscribed on a stone. I know that my Redeemer lives, and that at the last he will stand upon the earth. And then after my flesh has been destroyed, in my flesh I shall see God, and I shall see him on my side, right?
Face to face.
Face to face. Yeah. I should read it instead of quoting it from memory.
No.
But I know that my Redeemer lives. And the question, of course, is who is the Redeemer, right?
Yeah.
And this is, again, the Hebrew word goel. Well, the early church fathers, of course, right away said it's Jesus.
Right.
And I think that's right. I think we as Christians can assert that. In the original context of the book, I think it's God, which is saying the same thing for Christians, but that Job, in the same breath that he's accusing, or in one breath he's accusing God, and in the next breath he's trusting God because he doesn't have a choice. That he trusts in the same God that he accuses.
I think that is very much in this lament tradition.
Yeah, very much.
That once you speak the truth and you make it clear that you're ticked as all blazes, then there's also this sort of underlying faith that despite all of that, or underneath all of that, or within all of that, I know, somehow I really know that my Redeemer lives.
Yeah.
Right.
And at the last,
it's going to be all right.
It's going to be
right.
At the last, I'm going to see him.
I'm going to see him.
And he'll be on my side.
He sees him in the whirlwind.
Yeah.
So, there's something true to how the book goes.
Yeah.
About that, too.
And then as far as other passages, we've already mentioned the whirlwind speeches, chapters 38 through 41, I think are just some of the most beautiful poetry about creation. So I would highly recommend those. And then chapter 42, which a lot of people have trouble with too. They think, well, it's just tied up in a nice bow, and how can you replace 10 children?
Right.
Yeah. And I'm really heavily influenced here by my seminary teacher, Ellen Davis, who's written beautifully on the book of Job. And she says, the question to ask in chapter 42 is not how much does it cost God to give Job more children, because obviously it doesn't cost God anything to give more children. But how much does it cost Job to have more children?
Right.
How much does it cost Job, and presumably Mrs. Job, to bring children into a world where they know the potential for heartbreak?
Yeah.
Ellen Davis compares it to survivors of the Holocaust having children again, right? That's the bravest thing they could ever do. Right. To bring children in a world that has such potential for suffering is an act of bravery, of courage, and of faith that is just beautiful.
And I have to say, for that last chapter, to me, the most interesting things are to say, how is life described in the last chapter? How has it changed from the way it was in those first chapters?
Yeah.
So we talked about that. The daughters have names.
Yeah.
There are no servants. There's a sameness, but a different reality. It's not a righteous Job. It's a blessed Job you get. And righteousness isn't even part of the deal.
Right. And at the beginning, he's doing like all these sacrifices. He's even doing preemptive sacrifices. Like, what if my son sinned at their party last night? I better do a sacrifice just in case. Right. And at the end, that's sort of like, I'm going to be able to control the cosmos with my righteousness. And, I'm going to be like so anxious about it. That all goes away.
Yeah. So it's a very different sort of Job that you get. I think this understanding that everything's back plus some is not quite what it is.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, and I'm curious. Love the fact that Job prays for his so-called friends.
Yeah.
He becomes the intercessor.
Right.
And that is another moment in the book that is quite astonishing.
Yeah. Which is something they never did for him, right? Like Kathryn, if your interpretation, they didn't pray, you didn't speak to me. If that's the right translation, then they didn't intercede on his behalf. They were just mad at him for daring to suffer when that complicated their worldview. And yet Job has enough mercy and grace and forgiveness, to pray for them.
So there's a kind of restoration, not just of wealth and children, but a restoration of community.
Yeah.
At the end. Yeah.
I'm curious, and you both kind of indicated, I'm going off script a little bit, but you both indicated at the beginning that you had a disagreement about what happens at the end. So let's go. I want to go back to that. So go ahead.
One of the principal things of the description of Job at the end is it doesn't say he was cured.
Right.
So it never says his leprosy, which is what I call
skin disease,
is cured.
Huh.
So he remains, in my imagination, unclean and still has all of this children and all of these things. So, but you think that's not true?
Well, I think it's, a little bit of an argument from silence, but I think that's possible. But I think the text says that his fortunes are restored or he's restored, probably implies that he's healed as well. But I think it can be read either way.
Yeah.
So
this is fun. You get two biblical scholars who've read this book a lot.
It engenders conversation.
I'm just worried. Is he still? If he's not healed, is he still scratching himself with pot shards? Because that sounds so painful. Can he still have leprosy, but it not be as itchy? Can that be my interpretation?
Sure. We have 3 different interpretations. There you go.
Because that sounds sad.
Okay.
All right. And then what's one key theme you'd want people to look for as they enter the text?
I think we've done.
Yeah, we've done a lot of that. I think I would say, I'm going to refer back to my own teacher, Ellen Davis, again. She has this lovely question at the end. She says, the speech from the whirlwind asked Job and every other person of integrity this question: can you love what you do not control? Can you love what you do not control? The wild animals, the unclean animals, the Leviathan and Behemoth, these mythological creatures. Can you love your children whom you do not control? Can you love your God whom you do not control? I just think there's a kind of, in the whirlwind speeches, I think this element of freedom and delighting in freedom, and that God gives God's creatures the freedom to be who they're created to be. And Job learns at the end to live more like God in that way, to give his daughters these sensual names. And I don't think we've mentioned this, to give them an inheritance along with their brothers, which is just unheard of in the ancient world. I think there's a kind of call, certainly there's a call to humility in Job, particularly in the whirlwind speeches, but I think there really is also a call to live with freedom and delight in this wild, risky, but beautiful world that God has created.
Knowing you're God's child.
Yeah, knowing you're God's child.
I think another theme for me is what we often want is, when we go to heaven, is to go to a classroom with all the explanations.
Yeah.
We want an answer to our questions.
Yeah, right.
And what the book of Job says is you get a relationship, you don't get answers.
Yeah.
And so for me, the most important theme is, what do you want? Do you want answers or do you want a relationship? And can the relationship be more important?
And can it be enough?
Can it be enough?
Yeah. Yeah, I like that.
I love that. Well, always our final question. Describe this book in 7 words or less.
So we've struggled a little bit with this, but I think what we came up with is learning to live as God's creature, or alternatively, learning to live as God's child. And I think we've already talked about this, right? Learning to live with freedom, with humility, knowing that we're not going to get all the answers, but that we are in this relationship
I think
with
that's
God.
it.
Yeah.
If there's a message, that's it.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Great.
Well, thank you both so much for these rich insights. And what it's a complex book, I think. People maybe don't always realize that.
And it's fun to do this in dialogue.
Yeah, that was awesome.
Yeah.
That was really cool.
Because it is very dialogical. The book is very dialogical.
Yes, very good. Yeah. So appreciate that so much. And thank you to those of you who have joined us today on this episode of The Bible in a Year. I hope that this has inspired you to kind of dig deep into Job and into Scripture more generally. And I'd like to invite you, as you're entering the Bible, to go to our website at enterthebible.org, where there's more in this series, as well as a whole bunch of other resources, commentaries, newsletters, videos, podcast episodes, reflections, all kinds of stuff. And of course, please rate and review or like and subscribe to this podcast on YouTube or your favorite podcast app. And the very best compliment you can pay us is to share this podcast with a friend. So if you enjoyed it, please do that. Until next time.